So hello and welcome to one more business platform program. It's a pleasure to be with you. My name is George Bruff, and those of you who maybe don't know the program exists to help small and medium-sized business owners deal with the challenges of running a business in today's business environment. And our aim is to provide you with attitudes, behaviors, tools, everything that you need to double your results, to be successful, to have the kind of business that you always dreamed of having. And we do this in various ways. You know, we record programs with the tools. We have a community that helps the business people, and we also scour the world to bring you the very, very best in thought leaders, you know, executives, business people, consultants, you know, people who have something that can add value to you. And that's certainly the case today. I'm joined today by LIAM KEARY, who is currently Vice President, Global Head of Quality at Mais Pharmaceuticals. He's a phenomenal business leader, a great executive, also happens to be one of my favorite people in the world. So it's an even bigger pleasure than normal to have him on here. LIAM and I have had the pleasure of working together for many, many years in different situations. LIAM, thank you ever so much for your time this evening. Take a couple of minutes and just introduce yourself to the audience and kind of position who you are and kind of what you do.
Perfect. Thank you. First of all, George, I'm delighted to be here and have the opportunity to spend some time with you again. And thanks for inviting me to come on board, for today's session. A little bit of background on myself. Originally graduated from college as an electronics engineer and moved into the telecommunications business. That's probably about 30 years ago at this stage. And in that progression and career path, I ended up working next in the automotive sector and then in aerospace and defense before gravitating naturally, I will say, into the medical device segment. And from there, that's kind of followed my journey. I guess I've always gone into the areas that naturally have interested me over the years, and also presented challenge. So I went on from there to join a very large healthcare company. That's where George and I would have worked, as you know, for a number of years initially, and that was with Johnson & Johnson. And then I moved on in that organization to take on a corporate role where I had responsibility across all of the segments in Johnson & Johnson, not just the medical device segments, on the talent within the quality organization. At the time, it was about 10,000 people across the quality organization in J&J. And that also, as well as giving me an opportunity to work with people from all around the world and getting exposure to many, many different cultures, which I really enjoyed. From whether that was obviously North America, South America, Europe, and Asia as well, right? It really broadened the spectrum of learning for me. And as you say, George, after my time with Johnson & Johnson, I moved to work with Mallinckrodt. And so now I've moved on again into the scope of leading specialty pharmaceutical business that covers a range of medical device, drug, and biologic products. So quite a range, and some great experiences along the way. But all of the experiences that I've had an opportunity to have exposure on have all really formed the person that I am today. And hopefully I'll be able to share some of that experience and insight as well.
Absolutely. And, I was talking with a lady called Georgia Hassey a couple of weeks ago in the program, and Georgia's head of talent for Renault Nissan. So she's got, 350,000 people. She's Brazilian, lives in Paris. And I was asking her, what's the pandemic been like for you, for your business, and she said, here's what we're living. She said, we're living in 10 years of transformation every year. It was that in 2020. We're seeing it so far in 2021. And our expectation is that 2022 is going to be the same. So by the end of next year, we'll have gone through 30 years worth of transformation, right? And that's what they're seeing in their business. And I'm sure it's not different from in your business as well. What are you seeing the impact of the pandemic, specifically in terms of leadership? You know, how has your leadership had to change because of the pandemic?
I think one of the key differences for me, I mean, in the nature of my role, it's global. So I'm not exactly someone who's an individual contributor naturally, and I've got to engage with a broader team and a broader network. But in that normal paradigm, then I would have spent about 60% of my time traveling around the world, right, and visiting our various locations. So as of March 2020, you know, everything kind of tipped on its head, and that whole mode of operation completely changed. And so I've shifted now back, and as you can see, I'm in my own office at home, and like many others around the globe, and to have to shift from that in-person leadership where you can, you know, have a one-to-one conversation with people as well as having group interactions, to now shifting back into a Zoom environment or a WebEx environment, or in some cases just a normal phone call as your only means of connection, has been a significant alteration of how we operate. And now for in country, you know, with restrictions, many people, if you have plants around you in country, will appreciate that. Yeah, you can probably, depending on lockdown restrictions, you could have still managed to go from your home and visit them. I've done a little bit of that in our double plant, but we've also had to try and restrict the amount of time and the amount of people that are actually in any location to make it safe for those who are essential workers to be on site. So it's forced us to really look at how we interact with each other. And for me, not just as an individual, but also as a business, to alter our ways of interaction. So one of the things I would say to you is, now I would have ordinarily had team meetings on, let's say, a monthly frequency, and one-on-ones would have been more regular in between. But I shifted those up by 400%, because, you know, what was key was really how I actually maintained engagement with people and ensured that they were fully aware of what was happening across the business, and I could provide that context for them, but also to ensure that I was hearing the challenges that they were facing, and either helping them in that moment and giving them guidance on what to do, or bringing that back to the center of the organization and causing the business at large to change. So I think that connection, I would say, George, at this time, I've been able to, because I've been maintaining it all over that time period. I now actually, and in consultation with my own people, have been able to agree, listen, let's ease off a little bit of that now, because we're more comfortable in our environment and we know what we're doing. And I think it has helped by maintaining increased communication and increased interaction, maintains that trust. And we're fortunate. We've seen very good retention of our people in that time frame, which I know many other environments have not, right? And I think, you know, that it's always important to take care of your talent, right? And to be inclusive in how you interact with them as well. So for me, I think that's a key element. And naturally, and I know this is something that you yourself, George, have spent many years coaching many clients and many businesses to work on, getting really comfortable and proficient in the virtual environment, so that you can make it a productive environment, even though it's a distant one. And that includes the interactions with those cultures as well, globally, where the sense of relationship is sometimes more important than the topic and the business formalities that we have to deal with on an ongoing basis.
And which I think is the key. That's the key, and I'd like to explore that a little bit more, because, and you know this because you were involved in it. You know, 15 years ago when we started with Johnson & Johnson, you know, they were 62 individual little empires around the world, you know, and the head of quality was the head of quality for their own little empire. And then all of a sudden they moved to like sectors, and then they moved to like global roles, and they made that whole transition. And so the way you remember this, the way that we structured the program was 85% virtual and 15% face-to-face, because that was what the reality was. We wanted to teach people how to do it. And you've been through this experience many times, both as a participant and as a manager and as responsible for the program. The relationship piece is not a nice to have in the virtual environment. You know, it's the must have, isn't it? So talk a little bit about, you know, how do you build the relationship, and how important is that? Because, you know, there's a lot of leaders who think, well, the Zoom call, let's just get on, get it done. What are the indicators? What did the dashboard say? And this, that, and the next thing. You have a very different approach. I mean, you're very business oriented, you're very results oriented, but you value the relationship side of it. Talk a little bit about the impact that has on the results for you.
I mean, I'd like, absolutely, George. I think when I think of results, I think that's in terms of the what. That's what we deliver, right? When I think of the relationship, I think about the how. You know, how did you deliver it? And for me, you know, if someone delivers great results and they're very consistent, that's a fabulous thing to have. It's a given. Let's put it that way for any leader, right? But in truth, you know, if there's a body bag count along the way, right, or damaged relationships, then, you know, it's not necessarily sustainable, right, for either party, right? And so for me, I think what's a key on the relationship side is to get an understanding of what motivates people and what's their concern. What I've found in many of the interactions I've had, and it's certainly been reinforced, not weakened, in this last 18 months, has been really taking an approach that is one of, you know, I want to know at a personal level how people are dealing with this challenge. I want them to appreciate that their health and well-being is the most important aspect, because, you know, you want someone for the long run, not just to burn them out, right? And so I think the key thing for me is having a personal discussion with people. Where feasible, obviously, one-on-one conversations are much easier than in group, but still in group, creating that kind of environment where people can get that sense that it's okay to put your hand in the air. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to let them know that it's now working for them, and we have to find a way to make that positive. Because what I usually find, and it's kind of a play off that Einstein quote that you might be familiar with, which is, you know, it usually only takes, you know, you should really spend 55 minutes in every hour trying to work out what the problem is, because it only takes about 5 minutes to solve it when you know what it is and get everybody aligned behind that. And I kind of look at that with the relationship piece, because I can have one-on-ones with team members and literally we can fly through the actions, right? And we know exactly what we're doing. But if that personal piece is there, that's what makes it feasible. That's what makes it sustainable. And it also gives people a lot more confidence and insight as to the way you're interacting together. And I think it's been more pronounced and necessarily and more profound in the last 18 months, because people feel so disconnected from that human interaction.
Yeah.
And so it's important to bridge that. And for many, it's a case of moving outside their comfort zone to get there. But, you know, I think generally looking at people, we've done a pretty good job of it, right? Over the last 18 months to really change our approach. And I think one of the key things for us is to actually focus on that, and how do we retain that learning going forward. So for me, if you want to talk about the relationships, what I tended to find was when I was interacting with colleagues in Europe and the States, we tend to be very business proficient and business orientated. So the interactions, George, are a little less dependent on relationship, although it helps in this environment. But I've always found in other cultures, it's more important to create that linkage first. And you may recall we worked on a number of projects together, and in many instances, what we found dealing with colleagues, let's say in China or elsewhere, where relationship is a much stronger influencer, then, you know, we thought we were working on a project for 3 to 4 weeks, and it wasn't until we all got together face to face in whether that was Shanghai or elsewhere, right? And we got there face to face, that the conversation came across, well, we didn't really feel like we were working together until we met you, right? And so I think that kind of cultural intelligence, like emotional intelligence, right, is is really, really key in a global environment, right? And interacting with people of different nationalities, different cultures, and different organizational design as well. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. So tell me, what you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask, from your perspective, obviously you've seen quite a change, two levels of this, or you've seen quite a change as a result of the pandemic, and how you interact with your clients, right?
Mm-hmm.
And provide the solutions that you do. How has that impacted from your perspective? How has it caused you to change the way you operate? And then the second question I was going to ask, because I always ask in two questions, as you may recall, George. The second question I was going to ask on that cultural front, because you're a Scottish man who's living in Brazil, right? Who works with parties all around the world and has worked around the world, right? What are your insights on that whole cultural aspect as well?
So I think for me, what's been interesting, and the famous Steve Jobs commencement address at Stanford, when he says, you can only join the dots looking back. That kind of happened to me with the pandemic, because as you know, we've been working virtually for 15 years and teaching people how to do it, and running business transformation programs and projects and all that kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden, everybody's world looked like that. And everyone's scrambling to try and get online, and they're like, you seem to have done this before. And it's like, yeah, it's like we were waiting for you to catch up. It was interesting because, as you know, specifically at Johnson & Johnson, that those programs that we ran were so cutting edge. I mean, they really were phenomenal programs that were so far ahead of the time that actually the world is now reaping the benefit of what we learned doing there. And I think it's a lot. That's what's changed. I think it's broken paradigms, which is always the hardest thing to do. We were lucky because they were broken because we saw the results. That's why that's why we had so many years of doing it, because we kept seeing the results. But now the rest of the world had the paradigms broken for them. Like working from home, having a global talent pool, bringing people together for a project, and then disbanding the project. When it's no longer needed, and putting the people to work on something else. All of those things are now, everybody thinks they're new and different. Everyone's talking about squads and this and that, and it's like, my goodness, we've been doing that for a while, but it's great. I think it's great because we can now help people do these things. And then the other thing that you're talking about in terms of culture, I deliberately came to Brazil to look at the world through different lens, right? From a different hemisphere, different culture, different language. And although I'm a middle-aged white guy, maybe I'm an old white guy now, but I was the voice of diversity on many teams because I didn't live in North America or Europe. And I'd had that different view. And what it did do is it always helps me to be inclusive naturally. Because I know that that I'm different from a lot of people who might be sitting next to me, but also I can be their voice when people are not speaking up for them. And I think, to me, that's the big secret that businesses still haven't unlocked. My feeling is that businesses have gotten about as efficient as we can get. And we will always be incremental efficiency improvements, but technology is now a commodity. It's there won't be tremendous leaps that won't be available to everyone. So the only way to make a difference is to unlock the individual human potential that every human being has, which businesses have traditionally shied away from because people are messy and complicated and have baggage and all that kind of stuff. But I think if you want to be successful in the next 10 years, it's going to be the businesses that learn to use 25% of people's potential instead of just 5%. And that's a pulpit that I'm preaching from, but it's also my experience. My experience, that's where you unlock the potential. I mean, you've seen it. We go in and we work with a high potential group, and people say, I have no idea this group was capable of so much more, because we thought that they were pretty much at their limit. Or you walk into a dysfunctional group and you make them functional, and people think you're some sort of like magician, team whisperer. And it's like, no, we're just helping them figure out who they are, what they contribute, and to value the contribution of others. And it's simple stuff. It's simple, and I know you work very hard on that simple stuff. You work very hard on the simple mechanics of helping people to have a voice, to have their voice heard, and to participate. How do you see it, in your day-to-day with your team?
Well, I think one of the things on that aspect, I fully agree with everything you said, by the way. I think it's always a really rewarding conversation to be part of, to talk to someone and hear them, outline what their wishes are, their aspirations, and then, encourage them to really explore what their own potential is, mm-hmm. and then really to show them how simple it is to actually, if you will, unleash that, right? Mm-hmm. And what little basic, because it's never dramatic changes, right? It's just a little slight emphasis on one area, moving outside your comfort zone on another, and suddenly you can see an enormous improvement. Like a 10% improvement in an individual in 6 months is a phenomenal improvement. And once they start to see and understand the value in that process, the momentum just grows. Mm-hmm. For me, I kind of look at it as, how do you build a team, George? Because I mean, as a leader, okay, technically I do a few things here and there, right? But in truth, I don't do the work that my entire team does, right? I don't. I mean, they do it. And what my responsibility is to create an environment for them to be successful, for them to realize their potential, and then for me to get out of their way. Okay. And that's something, you've got to give them confidence and courage in the fact that, hey, look, you're not always going to be successful. And I use this analogy a lot when I talk to people, and I reflect on it myself. I mean, if you think of some of the greatest sports players, and I love using the analogy of sport, as you might recall, but I mean, if you look at LeBron James, right? LeBron James is probably one of the greatest basketball players. I know there'll be other views out there, but I think I'm in reasonably good company when I say that. Okay. But yet he doesn't make every pass. He doesn't make every shot he takes. And he occasionally makes a foul, right? It doesn't make him a bad player. It just, the reality is, everybody succeeds and fails at some time. Mm-hmm. And what defines us isn't necessarily the success or the failure. What defines us is how we respond to it, and how resilient we are. And so I think the more you work with people, and the more I found is really to remind someone when something goes wrong, hey, look, it hasn't gone our way, but there were some really great successes in there, right? Mm-hmm. And also some great learnings. Okay. So, you've got to commit to getting better as a human being. You've got to commit to getting better in how you operate your business process. You've got to commit to getting better as to how you interact with others, how you plan, how you don't overlean on your own strengths and cause them to derail you, and how you just pick up your weaknesses enough so that they aren't derailers. And so I think it's to your comment around the basics. I like the expression, which is, great teams are not necessarily made up of the greatest players. Mm-hmm. They're made up of teams who do, the ordinary things extraordinarily well. Yeah. So they're more consistent, they're more dependable, and they all know their roles and responsibilities. They have a clear playbook, they've got great communication, and then they execute flawlessly. And that's really part of the key element of creating that environment. So for me, when I look at my teams and how to create it, one is about creating that environment for them. And then the other part for me is around really looking for a team profile that's quite diverse. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so what I look for in that respect, George, are people who think differently than myself. Mm-hmm. Okay. If you build a team that looks exactly like you, then you're never going to be in disagreement, but you're also going to be quite limited in terms of your imagination, just to one person. Whereas if you build a team where you've got different styles, different personality types, different backgrounds, then what you're creating is a much richer thought process, and subsequently you also end up with more comprehensive and more successful outcomes. And that's what I found over my years leading teams across many different industry segments. I guess when we talk about that, we talk about diversity and we talk about inclusion. And the one thing I want to be very clear on this one is I'm not talking about tokenism. So I'm not talking about meeting a criteria that someone says you'll have X%, okay? But you know what, I have faith in the process, and I can see the data for where that I've done this, and ultimately over time, my diversity figures have gone above benchmark, right? Whether that's in made up of race or gender or combination thereof, and the people who have taken those roles in the organization have done so not based on that criteria, but rather because of the best people for the role. Okay, and that's what's key. So, but when I look at diversity and inclusion, I also think of belonging, right? And so, to your point, where you said there was a very valid point, that where that opinion isn't in the room, you'll express it, so it's heard. I think it comes down to having that presence, having that voice, but having that voice being heard is the belonging piece, and that's really what's important. And what I find is if you create that kind of environment, then it really does lead to high performing teams. Yeah. Where the leadership position is maybe with a small L, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a greater equality in how groups operate. What's your thinking on that, George, from where you've seen it from diversity and from your own experience?
Yeah,
where it's done,
I think the work that I tend to do with teams on that is helping them to become comfortable with the uncomfortable, right? Because diversity is uncomfortable, right? By its very nature, right? It's someone who is different from you, and that's the beauty of it. And I think a lot of it is helping leaders understand that the discomfort is a good thing. It's normal. It doesn't make you a bad person, right? It's normal, but get comfortable with it, because that's where the value is. Because I think people tend to think about, like you say, either tokenism or homogeneity, or or comfort, or what's easier. And no innovation or no great results come out of those words. Those words do not produce the results that we're looking for. So I think a lot of what I find is helping people to say, if it is comfortable, that's a red flag, right? It's it should be now. That doesn't mean conflict and people screaming at each other. It doesn't mean dysfunction. It doesn't mean dysfunction, but discomfort is a good thing, because you're being challenged. When I use the example of the Johnson & Johnson programs all the time, and people don't believe me, and until I actually, luckily I have witnesses like yourself who back it up. These teams produced world-class results that shocked the CEO of Johnson & Johnson. I mean, these teams would produce, so the head of quality, Kathy Wengel, who's now head of supply chain, or the CEO, they would see the end results of these, and they'd be like, I can't believe you guys, this is incredible. And then, but the teams never had a leader, because they were teams of leaders, right? All of them were high potential leaders. And as you said, no high performing team needs a leader. High performing team needs people to know when to lean in and when to lean back. When can I help, or when can the team help me? And I think getting a team to that level is phenomenal. But I think it always starts with that thing of valuing the discomfort, valuing what you're not seeing. But I wanted to pick up on one other thing that you talked about. You talked about how you don't do stuff. And you remember Alex Gorski talked about that, and he says, like, 5% of his time is doing stuff, and 95% is just telling people who they should be speaking to. Making connections, which I thought was fantastic. Alex is the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, but your career, you made a shift, okay, which is very similar to what a lot of the owners of small businesses and medium-sized businesses have to make, which is you went from a technical leader to being a people leader. Or as a friend of mine puts it, you went from being an expert to being the leader of experts, which is a very different thing. And that's the same with a lot of small business owners. They start the business, or medium-sized business, they start the business because, hey, I'm a lawyer, or I'm an accountant, or I'm an engineer, I've got this idea. And then all of a sudden they find that they're not doing engineering, they're not doing legal stuff, they're meant to, they're meant to be running a business, and they're meant to be people leaders. And you made some very, very conscious decisions when you made that shift. Talk us a little bit about the conscious decisions that you made in order to turn yourself into the great people leader that you are today.
Thanks, George. I mean, there's loads of examples of where I've made that kind of transition. Again, to your earlier point, always moving outside my comfort zone, because that's really where the learning happens, right? And so if I use the example of when I moved from Celestica into Johnson & Johnson into DePuy Synthes, first of all, I was working in a very large electronics manufacturing company in the UK, and I was approached to come and head up quality in the DePuy franchise in Johnson & Johnson, which is their orthopedics division, to become the head of quality for their largest manufacturing plant in the world. Now, first of all, I was really excited about the idea to go and work for the biggest healthcare company in the world, and naturally interested. But, a couple of seconds after that, then I said, well, hang on a second, I'm used to working with electronics, right? And now you're looking at making hips, knees, spinal joints, and many, many other things, right? And I know nothing about this market whatsoever, right? So
you've never worked in a factory that has a foundry in the middle of it. I remember those tours. You're walking through this factory, and all of a sudden there's these blacksmiths in the middle of a foundry.
Very, very, very well presented blacksmiths, I have to be honest. Okay, so and really cool equipment, but what was and it was quite impressive. But I think that the reality was you're faced with this almost self-imposed mental block, and one of the things I did, I had a trusted mentor at the time who I just reached out to and shared my nervousness, excitement, and anxiety, right, and talked through it with him in terms of what my concerns were, and he said, look, you've got really good leadership skills here, and you've also gotten excellent knowledge of the regulations as they apply to medical devices. So armed with that insight, I knew what I knew, and I also knew what I didn't know, right? So I said, I'll go and have the conversation with them, and I did. And I went to visit the facility, had conversations with the number of leaders in different parts, and I guess the key thing for me was understanding and assessing, if you will, the technical depth of the team that I was going to have responsibility for. Where I would see pitfalls in this area is if you're not the subject matter expert in the room, and you've got a team that doesn't have that subject matter expertise there, then you're weakening your likelihood of success. Okay, so having that kind of depth and strength in the team was key for me. And then as I moved into the company and joined them, right, it was really getting to know the team much better, because obviously in the interview process you get a little insight, and then from there it was really been curious, right? So learning as much as I could about the orthopedics business, getting to know the products, the processes, not necessarily to be an SME, but rather to have a good understanding of what you were leading, okay? But even more importantly was to get a good insight into your team, to quickly ascertain, where the team was at, who were your high potential, high performers, was the team structured appropriately, and getting a sense, obviously, from my perspective at the time, where were we at from our quality profile, and it was in a good place. So really that curiosity and that learning mindset, I think, George, is key getting into that piece. The other part as well is identifying some quick wins, right? that you can establish and quickly get in the organization. So identify pain points for me that I found that the organization had been struggling with for a time, and they needed resolution. And by being curious, by being totally transparent about what I knew and what I didn't know, it afforded you a chance to ask all of the silly questions that you can cover, right? But what it actually allowed me to do was actually get to the point where some of those silly questions actually just had been assumed or overlooked, right? And very quickly getting those wins in place helped build your own confidence as a leader, but more importantly, it actually built an assurance in the team and also in the business and business partners that you were capable of leading and delivering on that outcome. And that's really about that element of managing a team of subject matter experts, bringing the best out of them and delivering a result. And I think that's what's key. And then it was more on that, just building on it, and then getting very focused on the talent in the team. And for me, where I had joined it at the time, George, they had been looking for 9 months to find the individual to take the role. But after a year and a half, I actually identified my successor who was already in the team and brought her forward, right? From there. And she's still doing exceptionally well, right? So I think the point I'd make there is some very simple areas to focus on, but if you get those basics right, what I found again and again is it's actually really worked as a solid formula for me to be successful in those kind of transitions from a technical to being a people leader or a strategic leader in the business. Mm-hmm. And are there insights from your coaching, George, over the years where you've maybe seen a different angle on this or a slightly different approach?
I think not as much a different angle. I think the biggest watch out is always when you have to let go of what you enjoy doing, what you're good at, and what served you well. Like the Marshall Goldsmith book, what got you here won't get you there. And I think there's always a tipping point. Every time I'm doing coaching, there's a tipping point where I have to say to the person, look, you have to decide. You either want to be a really good individual contributor, right, and go down that path wherever it takes you, or you have to decide to be a people leader. But at the moment, you're doing more damage than good, right? You're trying to be an individual contributor with 20 people who report to you, and that's damaging them and damaging you. And I mean, you know me, I tend to be kind of radical anyway. I tend to say that, look, it's a decision point. Make a decision, right? Because you cannot have both. And you did a phenomenal job of making that decision. And then, I mean, you even went further. I mean, so for those of you who don't know, then Liam will tell the story. Once he'd done a massively incredible job in Depew, he then decided to get not to get out of quality, but to become responsible for developing all the hypos in quality compliance and regulatory in Johnson & Johnson, and be responsible for those programs. So it's basically what people would think was a training and development role, right? And that was incredibly brave, but also I know has served you incredibly well because of what you learned in that role. But it was incredibly brave because how many people said to you at that time, you're going to kill your career in quality? That's it. You'll never go anywhere in quality. Now here you are in quality at Mallinckrodt. But it was very courageous for you to take that decision for a lot of different reasons. Talk about the thought process that led you to that.
Well, I think there were a number of facets to it, because I had an option as well to go and work and take on responsibility in a smaller franchise, right, and be a head of quality there at the time. And a lot, it's kind of like buses, George. These opportunities don't come along singularly; they come along in multiples and almost at the same time, right? And so I was really, I would say, flattered by the other option, right? But what appealed to me more on this one is it gave me a chance to be part of the then quality leadership team for Johnson & Johnson, right? Which I kind of figured was going to be an invaluable experience for me in my career, and it certainly has been, right? Because you get a chance to work with some great leaders, okay, and just see how they operate and how they manage it. And each of those leaders, in many cases, would have had, you know, maybe 2,500 people within their group, so it's quite sizable, right? And there aren't many things that they haven't been through or seen, right? And so that was a great opportunity, but also moving outside the comfort zone again. I really, I would have a passion for talent and leadership development, and I think, to be honest, you really have to have a passion for what you love and what you're going to do if you want to be successful. And like I talked about in the Depew instance, George, you know, having a highly qualified team where you're working with them, right? Gives you that reassurance going in there that, you know, you're gonna both learn from the team, and also you're going to help them, right? And so the challenge for you really is how quickly can I understand how I can make a difference and bring value for them and allow them to be successful as well, right? And so all of those pieces play in together. But I think what was going through my head was a lot of nervousness, because yes, you're right. People had conversations with me saying, you know, this is not the direction for you to take. But the learnings that I've had through those latter years with J&J give me exposure. I mean, we delivered, I think it was 32 or 33 global projects, all 100% of them, you know, every person involved, 100% of them delivered on their leadership development goals, and the retention of our top personnel was of the order of 95% after 3 to 5 years, right? So those stats aren't bad, right? And not when you're including you know, emerging economies at the time, right, that are now fully emerged and very successful, but where turnover of 30% per annum was not uncommon. And so I think what it allowed me to see is just, to our earlier comment, the real potential that's not tapped into in most organizations. And it's because people automatically get task orientated, and the busier they get more and more task orientated and less collaborative, and they look, they're less prone to look outside the boundaries that they normally operate within. Whereas what we created was a team of people that could operate in that bifocal approach, where they could deal with the issues that were straight in front of them, but they were also looking around them at the distance as to how do we actually interact and what else is coming. So it was both developing strategic and tactical leaders that, you know, as I see from my LinkedIn connections, many of them are now leading much broader scopes of responsibility. Okay,
and that's something I want to pick up on, because when people say, you know, when you say you have a passion for talent, you know, and let me tell people, you know, that isn't, you know, Liam thinks this is a nice idea. Liam focuses on getting the best out of people. I personally know 9 or 10 phenomenal leaders who reported up to you, who are, you know, who went on to do much better, who are doing much bigger things, you know, who I personally worked with and coached. And I'm sure, I know there are many more. But one of the things that impresses me, and I'd love you to talk about it, is that you treat everybody for who they are and where they want to go. And, you know, so you don't have this bias of I've identified so-and-so as a hypo, so I'm going to treat him well. And this other person isn't a hypo, so I'm going to forget about them. You treat everyone on their merits. And, you know, and I think about you, I mean, and then this is no dig at you, but if you had looked at yourself when you came out of university, right, and your first job, there's no way in the world you would have said, oh yeah, this guy's going to be head of quality at Mallinckrodt in 25 years time, right? I mean, that wasn't on your horizon. It wasn't what you were thinking about. You wouldn't have been identified as that kind of hypo in those days. You would have been, you know, yeah, let's leave Liam on the side doing whatever it is that the quality folks do, and, you know, but you have a very different approach. You treat everyone as a person. You develop them according to where they want to go and how they can contribute. How do you manage to focus on the people as people?
Well, I think one of the things you have to work equally hard on yourself, right? To be able to develop people properly, because you have to know what your own strengths and your own biases are, and you have to either rethink them or unthink them, right? To get to where you want them to be. And I remember you used a beautiful presentation a number of years ago, George, where you talked about how people show up in terms of their behaviors, right? And how their personality is hardwired, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people tend to use that excuse that, hey, it's my personality, right? That's the way I am, right? But you likened it to the ingredients for making a cake, right?
Yeah.
And so if you regard your personality as just salt, right? But
Yeah.
and you don't think of all the other behaviors you can bring to bear. Now you can make anything you want, but if you only want to be one ingredient, then you're only going to taste and look the same to everybody. So and realizing that if you work hard on yourself to really become that self-aware, then you can sort of suspend your natural judgments and your own natural propensity to display your own home movies over other people's lives. And instead, you really have to understand the person, right? And so for me, when I interact with people, I try to understand, first of all, a little bit about them, what motivates them, why are they doing what they're doing, and it's almost like a reverse branding exercise where you're having that conversation with people and you're trying to help them to distill down what I was coached very well on this in the past by yourself, I have to be honest, and I've been practicing it for years since, right? So thank you. But it's kind of like a reverse process of, I'm trying to understand what are the 4 or 5 or even 3 key aspects that really define that person as to who they want to be, who they feel they are. Because you could be an individual who's got the most passion in the world for talent and leadership development, but if you don't share that and put it out there, then people will never know, right? And so to do that, in some cultures we just feel that's a little bit disingenuine, but I think you've got to understand, first of all, what's important to you, and then secondly, how do you share that with others in a way that you're comfortable to do so. And so in those kind of conversations with people, I get a real insight as to someone who's very execution oriented. So they love the operational aspect. That's what lights their fire. And I do challenge them a little bit and say, hey, listen, maybe, if your aspirations are in this leadership realm, then, you're going to need to work in this aspect that's going to be a new muscle memory for you, which is, that strategic aspect. And then, this is what you might get involved in our planning processes, or maybe how we go through strat planning in a business. Or they may have that motivation that they're all in change management, or they're all, and so on and so forth. And so, but once you understand that that's the motivation of a person and that's what they really love doing, and they either want to go the technical pathway or they want to go the leadership pathway, then really it's kind of like you've gone into a room that they didn't see before. You've shone a light and turned it on, right? For them. Now they're pondering it, processing it, and they'll come back to you, and then you can create a roadmap for people to succeed. But it's really about taking yourself out of that equation and just really asking great questions, and trying to avoid putting statements in that are more of your own personal bias, right? And that takes a lot of practice, right? But the other thing I would say, George, is each time you do that, it makes you a better leader, right? And for me, I get enormous positivity back from that, right? And it motivates me to do well, right? So I think that kind of expressive approach has been key, and that's what I've worked with individuals on over the years. And naturally, there are little ups and downs that you almost mentor people through, right? That's inevitable. But what I've found is once you educate someone, not necessarily train someone, but educate someone in this practice and thinking, they practice reflection a lot more, and at a self level, and they're very comfortable then at getting feedback, and they actively look to get feedback, and that's what makes them better over time, because it's committing to the continual improvement of yourself, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's the key thing. The other thing I talk a little bit to them about is holistic leadership, right? Which is leaders are, as we discussed, leaders are definitely valued on what they can deliver, right? We know that, okay? I mean, quarterly business performance is certainly drives most CEOs and what have you in organizations, but that deliver piece is just one component of leadership, and then the other part is about how you lead and develop your people, and the part that sometimes gets forgotten is how are you building that vision, because if you will, action without vision is a daydream, whereas vision without action is a nightmare. Okay, right? And so maybe I flipped that around. Maybe I said it the wrong way around, but you understand the concept, okay? And so what I'd say to you is, in that thinking, you want to develop that strategic component in your leaders, but the part that most leaders do forget is developing themselves.
Yeah.
Because they get so focused on the work that they're doing to deliver and execute on an ongoing thing. So it's getting that balance right. And developing well-rounded leaders with well-rounded characters, and that really positions them for success going forward in their career. Does that answer your question, or are there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one thing that scares people is, because business in the 20th century, in the early part of the 21st century, it was that command and control, and leave your personal problems at the door of the office before you get in. It was all of that, and that most leaders grew up in that environment. And now we're saying, no, you take the whole person and deal with the whole person and help the whole person be a whole person. And again, going full circle to what we talked about at the beginning, the pandemic's accelerated that, because you could pretend, if someone walked into an office, that they're a pawn on my chess piece, right? Because they're in the office, and when they're working from home and they've got like 2 kids and a sick mother, and they don't have a room where they can work from home, and so the kids are running around. It's harder to pretend that this person is not a person, right? So I think as a leader, it kind of puts that front and center, which I think is good. But it requires a different leadership competency and even a different leadership ethos, right? It's not command and control. When I say not command and control, that doesn't mean to say you don't measure anything, right? Or you don't hold people accountable. That's absolutely not what we're saying. But what we are saying is that you help people to figure out how to be successful, right? Juggling all the plates that they need to juggle, right? With all the challenges and that's your job as a leader. Your job as a leader is kind of like a football manager, right? Is to set the team up to give them the best chance of success. You cannot play the game for them, right? And you can't stand there directing things, because if they stop to look at you and say, what should I be doing now? The other team have just scored, right? It's the same thing for you as a leader, right? Your job is to set the team up, motivate them, give them the tools to be self-sufficient, and then make adjustments where necessary from your view, slightly more strategic.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, look, when you're talking about leading a global team or a large operation, and you're starting a company, and you want to adopt an entrepreneurial spirit and drive innovation at the heart of everything that you do, then really you have an obligation as a leader to create that vision, and people buy into the vision. That's what they identify with. In the industry I work in, people buy into the vision that you really want to address the needs of patients who are possibly underserved, right? That's certainly the motivation I see with my people. It's a leveler, right? Everybody in the industry, whether they're in quality, whether they're in operations, whether they're in S&T, HR, it doesn't matter, right? They're all of that opinion. Everyone's on the same page, and you can build anything back from there. And then so it's good to get people into that vision of why we're here, what difference we're trying to make, and what part they play in it. And then once you build that vision, George, then it's really about having really good communication as well in the organization. I think the recent pandemic has stretched us to look at more innovative ways of connecting with each other. But it's about checking in and letting people know. The other thing I also believe is very important, because strategy is nice. It's nice. It's a nice blue sky, flowery activity. I enjoy it. I have to be honest. I'm not dismissing it. What I'm saying is, but sometimes it's perceived as something you do once a year and you put it on a shelf, right? So for me, strategy serves two reasons. One is we're all really busy. Everybody is at every level in the organization, but I think it's important to review it on an ongoing basis, at least quarterly. And the reason being is that, every quarter you have new information, right? And you've got to take that new intelligence. And I believe the expression is no strategic plan survives first contact with reality. Okay. So, so it does morph, it does change as this new information comes to light. But the other value around doing something like meeting regularly, reviewing how you've done and how you've achieved it, is at the end of the year, and I've seen this in multiple companies, people forget what they've achieved, right? They forget the ground that they've made. They forget where they were starting from and what progress they've delivered, because people tend to naturally think about the next firefighting activity they're going to go into, or the next challenge, or some of the most recent things that they've gone through. Okay, but it's nice to take stock and show people periodically, and that's why I think active use in larger companies of town halls, newsletters, or blogs, or something else, right, are key, just to get it out there that hey, listen, this is our roadmap, and this is our progress to plan. And it gives people confidence when they look back and see what they've achieved, of what they can deliver going forward. So I think that's a key element as well. But there are multiple other ones, George. Beyond that, really, it's about having within those plans very, very much aligned deliverables to where the business is going. There's no point in you building a strategy that is completely out of sync with where the company wants to be. And then really building that into people's goals and objectives, so everyone knows the part they have to play in delivering it.
Wonderful. Great words of wisdom as always. To wrap up, Liam, what are the leadership competencies that you focus on and that you try and get your team to focus on to be successful in today's business environment? What are the 2 or 3 things that you say to them? Look, these are must-haves. These are the competencies we absolutely need to have, and the rest you can, the rest are nice to have. What are the must-haves?
I think that there's a couple. There's more than a couple, right? There's a lot in there. I'd love to go through the list, but probably at the core of it all in today's world is you have to have really good collaboration, right? And collaborative skills within the teams. So that and with that, George, it drives a lot of focus on our interpersonal capabilities and how we interact with others. But if I step it back, right, I probably say there are probably 4 areas where I really want to focus on. One is whenever I look at what the teams are doing and I see conflict or dysfunction, right, then normally what I find is that we haven't adequately defined the roles and responsibilities and the interactions between different people and different groups. Okay, and really what you tend to find is that the organization has evolved, it has grown quickly, or the organization has changed and morphed, or we have upsizing and downsizing, but the business processes haven't followed at the same pace. And so a lot of that conflict is that, well, you guys used to do that before. Well, we don't anymore, right? So it's really that roles and responsibility, because that's where the conflict comes from. And so getting the roles and responsibilities clear up front is like any good sports team. They have to know what position they're in. They have to know what role they play. And then beyond that, it's the playbook. How do we interact effectively as a group? And some of these playbooks can be quite dynamic. Because I'm in the quality space, I'll tell you it should be a standard operating procedure, right, or a policy
with appropriate change control.
Absolutely, and revision management. And so, but there are also some softer playbook approaches that are for more dynamic situations that are less compliance emphasized, right? So if you want to create a really good innovation environment, it's about how do you let everybody know how we should interact and play together, right? And then I remember having a conversation with a retired 4-star general from the U.S. Army many years ago, and he was responsible for training the troops before they traveled to the wars in the Middle East. And one of the things that they actually did was they used to do a mock-up of the locations they were going to in the Mojave Desert. And there were just basically 2,500 National Guard members there with old kit and old equipment. And next thing, 5,000, of these freshly trained Marines would come in with the latest kit, the latest technology. And in 95% of the occasions that they fought each other, obviously not with real bullets, but they fought each other, the National Guard group won every single time. And they won not because obviously they didn't have the latest kit, they weren't as well trained as the Marines, but everybody knew the role that they had to play and what they had to do. Interesting in relation to our conversation earlier, although there were leaders, and this is unusual for an army, right from the lowest levels in the entire battalion, they could question all the way up without any kind of retribution for doing so. And that kind of interaction meant they had great communication, great roles and responsibility clarity, very clear playbook, and they operated more effectively. They executed their mission more flawlessly than this well-trained group that were held back by the rigor of hierarchy, the rigor of if you will, overcomplicated solutions for what really only required a simple response, right? And so I kind of look at that piece. It's really about building that effective communication in the team where information flows evenly and easily upwards and downwards and sideways, right? And so that you empower the team effectively to move as quickly as possible. And then really from there, you execute seamlessly. But so that kind of plays into collaboration, results orientation, and talent development. And I would also include in there, George, the real importance around diversity, inclusion, and belonging, okay? As being key to getting the right environment and positioning your organization not only for success today, but success in the future.
That's absolutely incredible. Thank you, Liam. Thank you as always for your generosity of sharing your wisdom, your experience, your knowledge. It's been fantastic. I really appreciate it. Wish you every success going forward as always. And hopefully we'll have the chance to invite you back sometime in the near future when your agenda allows to do a part 2 for everyone. Thank you ever so much. I appreciate it.
Very welcome. It's been my pleasure. Thank you, George.